Hello everyone, welcome to SwitchUp and to another episode of our Battle in the Backlog series. In this series I take on my quite substantial backlog and try to complete 6 games, then document those games for you, giving you a mini review of sorts, going into how long it took me to complete it and letting you know ultimately, in my opinion, whether these games may be worth your time and money. So which games have I completed recently and ultimately were they worth it? Well, let's find out. So the first game I completed then was just after Christmas, and this was World of Horror. Now this was one of my games of 2023 if you've seen our top games list from the back end of last year, and it's basically a text adventure game set in Japan during the 1980s where a dark force of some description is starting to take over a town. It's very Lovecraftian in that respect, but also took inspiration from manga artist Junji Ito in terms of its artistic direction. And you basically need to find 5 keys to unlock the lighthouse, which seems to be the source of all the strange goings on. You do this by visiting areas within the town from your hub menu, where a series of different circumstances will play out, and you'll need to make a decision which could affect your key vital signs such as sanity, health, logic, etc. You'll be taking part in battles which are turn-based, gaining perks and upgrades that you can add to your character, and there are a number of different endings to try and find. Now it took me about 3 hours to get to an ending that I was happy with. You could probably finish the game in about an hour, but obviously I died a few times on the way, so I would say 3 hours is a fair summary of the time I spent. But it's the sort of game that I've played a couple of times again through since, just because it's so much fun and there are those other endings to go for. Bit of an acquired taste I would say, but if you have any sort of affinity for horror or the early text adventures from back in the day, this is a great pickup and one that I would recommend. Now I do just want to add before I move on that I did hear there was a bug in this game where if you save and quit out of your game and then try to load it back up, it wouldn't find your save data. Now I never experienced this once because every playthrough I did, I either finished at the time or I just put the Switch into sleep mode, so I don't know if this is still the case, but just something to be aware of. The next game I finished was another from my top games of 2023, funnily enough, and it's the big one from this list. This was Fire Emblem Engage. This took me about 50 hours all told to finish. That includes a number of the side quests that I did as I went along. And for me, this was the best Fire Emblem game I'd played in a long time. I know a lot of people will prefer Three Houses over this one, but for me this just went back to the roots of what this series was about, back when I used to play it on the Game Boy Advance. I loved the battling, I thought it was fantastic. I like the fact they stepped away from relationships a little bit from Three Houses, just for my personal taste that suited me better. And I also like some of the tweaks they made in terms of things such as permadeath. It's still here, but as well as being able to pick the casual mode or that hardcore mode where you can lose your characters permanently, there is also now a feature where you can rewind a few turns if you do make a fatal mistake. It's not a given this means that characters survive because things can still play out badly, but it was definitely a good inclusion. And I did like the whole engage idea of merging with characters from previous games. I would go so far as to say this is one of my favourite games on the Switch and I really thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. 50 hours is the longest I've spent on a game in a long time I must say, but I couldn't put this one down. I only paid £20 for it physically as well, so it was an absolute bargain. And if you can find it for a similar sort of price, well it's an absolute no-brainer, pick this one up.
Father.
The next one I finished was quite recently actually, the rest of these are quite recent completions, and that was The Cub. Now we did a video on this and I have since reviewed it, gave it a score of 81%, and this is basically an action platformer where you need to guide the titular Cub character across a desolate Earth in a time where the human race has left Earth and gone to relocate to Mars. A group of astronauts come back to Earth to find it in the state it is now and find the Cub and start to hunt him, and you basically need to get through levels filled with hazards and traps, very similar to something like Limbo, in order to stay alive. It has a very heavy emphasis on precision platforming, fluidity, parkour, as well as some stealth sections where you try to keep yourself away from those astronauts, and it plays very well indeed. There are a lot of collectibles to find which just flesh out the world and let you know exactly what happened to the Earth, and it certainly provides a challenge. There are some very difficult platforming sections in there. It took me about 2.5 hours to finish. I would say I probably finished this on the earlier side. I think it could probably take up to about 4 hours depending on your skill set. And whilst the price is reasonable in my opinion, I do feel that because it does have quite a low runtime, some people may want to wait for a sale. That's not a knock on the game's quality though, just something to bear in mind. But I did really enjoy this one, and that was game number 3. Then I finished a game called Ravenous Devils. Now I bought this game on sale. I think it was about £2.20, something like that. And it's quite an interesting one and quite a difficult one to describe. It's basically a resource management game where you play as a husband and wife who have bought a new business, being a pie shop, which the wife runs, and they also own the property above, which they use as a tailor, and that's the husband's business. Now it's heavily inspired by Sweeney Todd in the fact that the husband murders the customers from his tailor shop, drops them down a shaft into a kitchen below where the wife will chop the people up and then serve them in the pies. And it's all about trying to keep the business running, keeping customers happy whilst inadvertently murdering others upstairs. It's a very clever game and actually gets quite complex the further you go in. You can almost make it as difficult as you want, because as you go on you can buy upgrades and you can start to grow vegetables, for example, using dead bodies as fertilizer, but you don't have to do that. And of course if you do it, it adds more ingredients to your pies, which makes that part of the time resource management a little more difficult. You can also hire help to assist you in serving in the restaurant, and you can also serve the customers gin if they start to become impatient because you're taking too long for their order. All these things are upgrades, and like I say, it's quite a clever game in that the more you put into it, the more you get out. It took me about 7 hours to finish the story, and there is a free play or endless mode as well if you want to have a go on that. It's quite blurry in handheld mode where I played it for the most part, and it's not very polished I must say, but if you can find it on sale and you just want something a little different or you enjoy time management games, this one could be worth a pickup.
Alright.
The penultimate game during this time was the story mode for Mortal Kombat 1. Now I picked this up around Christmas time when it dropped on sale for quite a good price actually, knowing it had problems, and obviously in terms of the graphics it did look a bit of a mess on the Switch, but it has had a few patches since, and I love the Mortal Kombat series not just in terms of the gameplay but in this story that they've woven over the years in their many reboots. I was very interested to see where they'd take it with this newest reboot or reimagining of the storyline if you like, and I must say I did really enjoy where the story went. It became perhaps a little too meta towards the end. There was a point about 75% of the way through where I felt once again they just over convoluted the timeline and could have just left it be, but that's just a personal opinion. But in terms of the gameplay, it runs at a smooth 60 frames per second when playing, when actually in a fight. A lot of the issues come during cutscenes, I'll get onto that in a sec. I must say I didn't die once, I only actually lost one round, let alone a match during the whole of the story mode, which for me, I mean, these games used to be disgustingly hard. I do think maybe they're a bit too easy these days, but of course if you're playing with friends or online, you'll find a challenge there for sure. So yeah, in terms of the performance, the biggest problem I had with it was the screen tearing whenever you transitioned from a fight back into a pre-rendered cutscene or vice versa. Whilst the cutscenes do look fantastic, it does really struggle when you go back from a fight into those cutscenes. And as I mentioned, you have a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds of screen tearing to some degree as the game sorts itself back out. Now of course, because the cutscenes are interrupted so often by the fighting, as they should be, it does mean you'll see this quite frequently, and it is quite distracting and it is quite frustrating. But again, I will reiterate, at least the issues are only in the cutscenes and not during the actual gameplay. That would be horrendous. Still something to bear in mind, and I know some people won't want to touch it on the Switch because of that, but if the Switch is your only way to play it, it is playable enough in terms of actual gameplay. There are just those issues in terms of presentation. The load times I did hear were a major problem at launch. Now again, I've only played story mode, I'm not talking about waiting for online matches or anything like that, but I can say that the load times weren't too bad when playing. I wouldn't have highlighted them as a problem had I not heard it was an issue at launch. And the final game then was a game called Heidelberg 1693. Now, having just said that I found Mortal Kombat's story mode a little too easy, this is quite possibly the hardest game I've played in many a year. This was brutal. It's basically a 2D platformer where you play as a member of the Musketeers, King Louis XIV's Musketeers, fighting in Germany, a zombie infested Germany in the 17th century. Now, it has about 20 levels. And the main mechanic here is that whilst you can fight with your sword, if you want to use your musket, you have to reload after every shot. And it's a very obvious animation, a very slow animation of you putting the powder down into the gun. And obviously at these times you're incredibly vulnerable and can be killed. So it becomes about knowing when to use those shots and when to use your sword. Now, any enemies using a gun have the same issue, so it is fair in that respect. But the levels are just absolutely jam-packed with enemies. There are things flying at you every which way, bullets coming out of nowhere, enemies being revived, enemies just apparating in front of you. It is very, very difficult. The bosses are some of the toughest I've played in a while, I must say. And there were times where I was constantly playing the same bit. And I'm not one for difficult games. If you've watched the channel before, you know of myself and Mark. He's the one that enjoys that more than me. But I couldn't put this game down. I was determined to finish it, and I really did enjoy it. It actually counts how many lives you've lost in the pause menu if you look at the top of the screen in the pause menu. And I think just before I beat the final boss, I had one more check. I think I might have lost one more life after this before beating the game, but I was on 474 losses at that point. It's brutal, but it's a great game. I really enjoyed this one. You have to be up for a challenge. You have to accept certain parts that feel a little unfair, just in terms of some of the enemy patterns and what they can do and how quickly they can just appear. But once you get the hang of it, it's a great game. I really enjoyed this one. Took me about 5.5 hours to finish, but that 5.5 hours felt like a lifetime because it was such a difficult game to get through. So there you have it, another 6 games off the backlog. Quite happy with this episode, I must say, to get a big one off like Fire Emblem and a difficult one off like Heidelberg, as well as finally playing something like Mortal Kombat. Yeah, pretty pleased with that. Please do let me know of any games you've completed over this period. I love to read what other people play. It's one of my little pleasures in life, just to see what other people enjoy in terms of games and when they finished them, how long it took. Stick it all in the comment section below. Don't forget, if you're looking for eShop credit to pick any games up, you can get your eShop cards at our website, switchup.gg. You get yourself 5% back in cash back. You can use that against a future purchase, of course. And there's a link down there to Play Asia if you're looking to import any games. Use the link, use the code stated, and you get yourself 5% off of your order from there. A quick thank you to our patrons and our channel members for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.